everyone. I hope y'all are doing absolutely fantastic. My name is John. Super excited for another lesson today. Our first three lessons, we talked about chess psychology, winning mentality. We talked about creating plans, and we talked about space, which, in my opinion, is the most important element in all of chess, and what you should look out for most when you're creating your plans and you're playing the game. And so today, just really excited for another lesson. We're going to be talking about what makes a piece good, right? Good versus bad. What is a good piece? And so I think sometimes it can be very confusing, whether a piece is good or bad. I think sometimes a piece can look good, but actually doesn't do very much, and vice versa. Sometimes a piece can look bad, it might be passive, might not have a lot of squares to work with, but it can actually play a very important defensive role or even an attacking role as well. And so we're going to look at two really awesome games from two previous world champions. The first game will be a game from Capablanca as black, as you can see from the starting position here. And then the next game is going to be a very classic game, Fischer versus Petrosian, and what makes a piece good. And so before we jump into these games here, just want to talk a little bit about what makes a good piece. And so there can be some disagreement. And once again, chess is very complex, very nuanced, right? So you have, each person is going to have a different take, and each position is going to be very different, right? So some positions, you might think, oh, that's a good piece, but other positions, that same piece could be bad, right? And so chess is very nuanced. And so, as you play longer, you'll be able to really recognize and think, hey, what is this piece doing, right? That's an important element of deciding whether a piece is good or bad. It's deciding, hey, figuring out what is that piece doing? And is that thing that it's doing, is that impeding my progress? Is that something I need to get a workaround, right? And so that's, definitely plays a big part into, what makes a piece good or bad, right? And so part of that too, and with impeding your progress and whether or not a piece is good or bad, is how many squares, how much space does that piece control, right? So sometimes a piece can be very open in the position, right? It can be, let's say a bishop, it can be very open. We actually looked at that Janowski versus Capablanca game last lesson, where Capablanca actually moved his bishop back. The bishop was very open, but it actually didn't really control any squares that impeded White's progress in that game, right? On that H7 B1 diagonal. So, sometimes the piece can control a lot of squares, but those squares don't necessarily have much of an impact on the position, right? Other times, the piece can be very blocked in, such as a French bishop, but you can actually argue the French bishop is a decent piece because not only does it defend the queen side, from any attacks from white side, which can sometimes be a disadvantage. Let's say for black in the Caro-Kann when the bishop comes out very early. Sometimes black's queen side can get hit very quickly. But also with the French bishop being locked in, it can also help with the queenside attack. And if it ever does get out, it can be a very effective piece. I can think of some very awesome examples in the win hour for black. And so yeah, so really what makes a piece good or bad, right, is how many squares does it control? Do those squares actually impede the opponent's progress, right? And do they help you in your own plan, right? And so yeah, so just jumping into this Capablanca game here, and so I really just love this game. This game is from the book Endgame Strategy by Mikhail Shereshevsky, which is honestly my all-time favorite chess book I've ever read. Really makes endgame study, I think, pretty fun and enjoyable. So if you ever want to pick up a good chess book, I think Endgame Strategy by Mikhail Shereshevsky is a great pick. And so in this position, Capablanca is white against an opponent named Klein. And so this is from the early 1900s. And Capablanca is black here, has a pretty obvious advantage, right? We already see black has more space in the position. We see, far advanced, pawns on the king side, plenty of central space. These knights are incredibly strong pieces, right? We also see, basically, black's just more active in general, right? Like this bishop on d3 is just kind of a really passive piece. Like you can see this, imagine this bishop playing to e6, maybe being a better piece than this bishop on d3. The rooks are kind of passive, whereas black can activate his rook on d8. This knight is definitely closer to this king. I feel like white's king definitely feels a little more not quite as safe, right, as black's king. And this knight on f4 is just incredible, right? So yeah, definitely, white is definitely slightly worse, and Capablanca knows that he has a slight advantage here as black, and so in this position, it's really interesting because Cobb Blanca actually doesn't really talk about this move too much because it's just a very natural move for him. But I think, when you first look at this position, I think a natural move you would think about playing is something like Bishop E6, maybe even something like H3, just trying to gain more space on the on the king side, and maybe try to set up some attacks, something like that. Yeah, something I think those moves would be maybe pretty logical for black here. But in this position, Capablanca makes a very interesting move. He actually goes knight takes d3. And so this move is very interesting because it's so unnatural, right? Like knight takes d3, like taking this bishop that is basically impeded by all these light pawns, right? It's not really doing anything and giving up this knight that's on this dream f4 square for this bishop on d3, right? Like this knight on f4 is such a strong piece, right? And it even like restricts the king from the g2 square. I mean, just an amazing knight that has no way to be attacked by any pawns or anything. Instead of trading for this bishop that isn't just isn't really doing much. But Capablanca thinks about this very pragmatically. So here, this knight on f4 is a great piece. Don't get me wrong, it is an amazing piece. But think about it this way too. This knight being on f4 actually makes this knight on g6 not quite as good of a piece, right? Because this knight on g6 wishes it could come to the f4 square, right? And be more active, but instead it's just playing a support role for the knight on g6. And so this is what would be considered superfluous knights. So basically when one knight is supporting the other and wishes it could be on the square that the other knight is on. But sadly, in chess, you can't have two pieces on the same square at the same time, right? So yeah, so by getting rid of this bishop on d3, right, knight takes d3, this opens up the possibility for the other knight to come to f4, right? So by taking the bishop on d3, even though you do get rid of your best knight, it does open up and improve the potential for your other knight, right? And so, as we're going to talk about in this lesson as well, sometimes your best piece, getting rid of that best piece, if that improves all of your other pieces, right? That net gain of getting rid of your best piece, but improving all of your other pieces can actually be a very strong benefit to your position. And so never be too locked in that, oh, I cannot get rid of my best piece. I must keep this to the very end of the game, right? If you can get rid of if you can get rid of your best piece and that improves all of your other pieces, sometimes it's totally worth it. In fact, I would say most of the time it's actually pretty worth it if it does improve all of your other pieces, right? This idea of net gains, right? You lose your best piece, but all of your other pieces become better. That, just that adds up, right? So knight takes d3. And also, this bishop, right, on d3, even though it's a bad piece, it's almost like a French bishop in a way. It actually plays a very, very important defensive role. So if you see all these pawns on light squares, right? Yes, they block the bishop in, but think about it. This bishop on d3 actually helps defend these light square pawns. So by getting rid of this bishop on d3 by Capablanca going knight takes d3, these light square pawns actually become weaker, right, and harder to protect. And since these pawns are the pawns that are closest to the white king actually inherently becomes less secure, right? So getting rid of that bishop actually not only improves this g6 knight, but it also makes it easier for all of black's pieces to try to attack because now they're more targets, right? Now the light pawns are less secure. And think about it too. By taking rid of this light square bishop, getting rid of the light square bishop, now this bishop on c8 is unchallenged, right? There's no light square bishop that needs to compete against. So this light square bishop is inherently going to be a better square and a better piece and can take better advantage of these pawns that are on light squares and they're stuck on light squares too, right? This pawn on e4 is not going anywhere. This pawn on g4 is not going anywhere. This pawn on f3 is definitely not going anywhere because, I mean, it's f4 square is guarded 3 times. So d3, awesome move, really deep move. And so, Capablanca is like, hey, I know my knight on f4 is a really good piece, but this bishop on d3 is actually a strangely underrated piece, right? And really kind of impedes my progress. And by getting rid of it, it actually makes all of my other pieces better. And so I'm going to just take that bishop and get rid of that. And now it makes all of my other pieces better, right? And so also, especially the knight on g6 and the bishop on c8 better, right? Now the other knight can go to f4, and now the bishop on c8 is unopposed and can more easily attack all the light square pawns. So knight takes d3. Knight takes d3, bishop e6, right? Just continuing the plan now, just improving all the pieces. Rook d1, rook d8, very natural moves. b3, knight f4. So once again, just improving all the pieces. Capablanca's idea is to try to fight for the D file, which makes a lot of sense because in chess, always improve your worst piece, right? This rook on A8 is not very active, so how can we improve that? We can double it on the D file, right? Go rook D7, rook D8, something like that, and we'll see something like that in the game here. So the knight on D3 is blocking the D file, so let's fight for that D file, right? So knight F4, knight G2, knight takes D3, takes, takes, queen takes, rook d8. Everything coming at tempo, everything coming very aggressively, right? And so now we see Capablanca start a really awesome plan here. And so here, this kind of brings into into the forefront the idea of principle of two weaknesses. And so here after queen e2, right, we have control of the d file. Capablanca goes h3, gaining space, right? And limiting, moving the pawn 2 squares away from promotion, that idea of potential, right? Yeah, it cannot promote right now, but hey, maybe down the line it can promote, right? Also, just removing an escape square from the king on h1, right? So we have knight e3, a5. This idea of principle of two weaknesses, right? So we have an attack coming on the king side. You could say that the weakness in White's position here, you could probably argue two weaknesses already on the king side, right? With these pawns being attacked by this light square bishop, but also I would say this king is a weakness, right? Especially with this pawn guard the g2 square. So whenever you have a weakness on one side of the board, if you can create a second weakness on the opposite side of the board, so the pieces are just torn, like, oh, I can't guard everything, right? That's when the position falls apart. The pipeline is severed usually. A5. That's the whole idea Capablanca is going for here. The principle of two weaknesses, right? So A5, the idea is to go A4 and just really crack open on the queen side as well. Rook F1, A4. Just continuing the plan, right? If it's a good plan, keep going for it. C4, rook D4. And now Capablanca sees a weakness here. He's like, okay, this D4 square has been weakened. I'm going to take advantage of it and actually slightly improve my position a little bit, right? Now the idea is actually to try to go queen to D8 and try to control the D file, maybe bringing the rook to D2. Very, very strong ideas here. So we have knight C2, rook D7. So Capablanca put the rook on D4 to try to provoke Klein into putting his knight on C2, which is not quite as aggressively placed as it would be if it was on E3, right? So we have knight C2, rook D7, knight back to E3, queen to D8. Boom, very aggressive, very on point. Rook to D1, trying to fight for control of the D file, trying to prevent rook to D2, right? Rook takes, knight takes. So if queen takes instead of knight takes, if queen takes rook instead of knight takes, I mean, it would have been roughly the same thing. Queen takes runs actually into queen d4. This is actually a very, very strong move here. The idea that is that, hey, Klein, you can take the queen, right? You can take the queen on d4, but that gives me a passed pawn. And especially since this king is kind of limited, I mean, that passed pawns can be pretty decisive very quickly, just advancing. And so the queen's just very actively placed here. So instead, Klein goes for knight takes, queen d4. I mean, this is still very, very, very strong. The queen is just so active, right? It puts pressure on the c4 pawn, so now b takes a4 is not really reasonable. The queen, guards the g1 square, so this king's feeling even more stuck, right? It literally cannot move in this position. Also, the queen can come to a1, maybe set up a pretty devastating pin on the first rank. That's really effective too. Just a really awesome square for the queen. So knight f2 and b5, and this is just a really awesome move, and pretty much sets up the final ending of the game, right? So, with b5, it just really cracks open White's structure in this position, and so really just I mean the queenside structure is just getting blown up here. So we have c takes b5, a takes b3, a really awesome intermediate move idea here. The idea is that if you know just taking on c6 is too slow. I mean, after b takes a2, there's no way to stop the pawn from queening, right? This is just completely winning for black, and so in the game we actually have a takes b3, which is a stronger move. But now bishop takes b3 is really, really strong, and this really just ties everything together that Capablanca's been going for. There's no time for taking on c6 because queen a1 check. And guess what? This h3 pawn guards the g2 square. So really the only way to block the check is knight d1, but just bishop takes d1. And actually now there's bishop takes f3 check ideas that are very, very devastating. So this is just completely resignable for white. So instead we have knight takes h3. But now after bishop d1, and now, this is once again where you see that, Capablanca is taking full advantage. He's like, hey, I've eliminated your light square bishop, all the way back from a few moves ago, right? I took on d3, I give up my good knight, and now my bishop is just unopposed, and now you have no way to protect your light square pawns. Everything's just coming together. It's really awesome to see. I love watching these world championship games and or games that world champion players play, and just everything coming together. It's really exciting. So bishop d1, queen f1, and now c takes b5, and white can't even take the pawn because bishop takes f3 is actually checkmate, which is pretty devastating, right? And so we have c takes b5, and really there's just no way to prevent, the queen, right? It's just b4, b3, b2, b1. There's no real way to try to prevent the pawn from queening, right? So you could now say that the two weaknesses, right? These pawns on the light squares that coincides with king safety. So these pawns being weak, that's one weakness, and being attacked by the bishop. But the second weakness is just black having this pawn that's unopposed, right? Very strong. So we have king b2, b4, um, queen b5, b3. Just not even worrying about any checks. Queen e8 check, king g7. And once again, like knight takes g5 never works here because of this knight takes g5, queen to d2 check. And you're just going to pick up the knight here, and that's just totally winning, right? So instead we have queen e7. And it's funny, Capablanca doesn't even worry about it. He's like, you know what? You can take my pawn with check. I don't care. I'm just going b2. I'm just going to queen. And so if queen takes g5, the king can just run out this way. It's always nice that the queen on d4 guards the d8 square, so there's no queen to d8 check. So like if queen here, the king just runs out with king to e7 and just gets away. Yeah, totally winning here. So we have instead knight takes g5, and now just a very nice defensive idea as white is threatening to take on f7. Just bishop to b3, just guards everything. Guards the pawn on f7, even guards against knight e6 check ideas, making use of the pin, and just guards everything. And there's just no defense here. There's queen d2 check, which is a threat. The big threat really is just queening the pawn. So it's just game over. So here in this position, Klein as white decides to go for some, desperate perpetual ideas. Knight takes f7, bishop takes f7. There's just no way this works though, because the king actually ends up hiding. Checks and king e7. Nice little finesse idea. Queen g5 check and king to e8, and the checks are out. And there's no way to prevent b1 queen. So this position is totally resignable, and in fact, white did resign in this position. And so really hope this game was helpful, and really enjoyed this game. This move back here with knight takes d3, giving up the really awesome, beautiful looking knight for this ugly bishop, right? It looks so unnatural, but it's so effective, right? This whole knight takes d3 move is really the most important, pivotal move of the game. And so, even though the knight looks really awesome, the bishop, was very good defensive piece, right, for white's position. Kind of held all the pawns together. Very, effective defensive piece. But by getting rid of that bishop, basically all of black's pieces were able to flow in the position. The other knight could jump into f4, which is very effective. We saw that right away. And then most importantly, the light square bishop that black has on c8 here is unopposed and could not only attack the light square pawns, but really just jump into the game and not have any fight from white for his light square bishop, because it's gone now. So knight takes d3, just a really awesome move. And so once again, just reiterating what we were talking about before, what makes a piece good, right? Sometimes you can have a really good piece, that controls a lot of squares, that's very effective, right? Like this knight on f4 is unopposed, cannot be attacked, very effective, controls a lot of squares, very good piece, right? And it definitely does impede white's progress a lot. Very effective. However, if you can trade that good piece and make all of your other pieces better, right? Sometimes that's worth considering, because that net gain of improving all of your other pieces at the cost of one piece can be really effective. And so, never be afraid never be too, tied up and too, too sentimental to one piece that you're afraid to give it up, right? Because that can, yeah, basically being tied down like that can really hold you back. So definitely don't be afraid to give up that really good piece if that means all of your other pieces can be better. But once again, each situation is different. Most of the time, honestly, it is better just to hold on to that piece, right? That's really strong because if it's really putting that much pressure on your opponent's position, just hold on to it. But sometimes it can be better. Once again, chess is nuanced just to give up that piece to make all of your other pieces better. So I really hope you enjoyed this game. Just jumping into the next game here. So this game is very iconic. This is Fischer versus Petrosian, Game 7 from 1971. So this is Fischer's final trek, basically, to the 1972 match with Spassky, where he became the world champion. And so, um, at this point, people had a pretty solid understanding that, yeah, Fischer's the best player in the world, and Fischer really, really, really demonstrated it in this game. And so it's really interesting when you see the best players in the world play. I think Carlsen is definitely a very, very relevant example. When you see the best players in the world play and all these world champions, they always get the positions they want, right? They always steer the positions to where they want it to be that really, fit their style and just give them that competitive, even psychological advantage, right? And so here we really see Fischer do that and just totally outplay Petrosian and really understands what makes a piece good. He really, Fischer just understands this as white here. So jumping in this game, this is going to be a whole game here versus the last game. So e4, c5, we have a Sicilian, knight f3, e6. d4, takes, a6. This is the con Sicilian for black. Very, very popular, very effective. Maybe not quite as popular today as it used to be. I think the Taimanov is definitely a bit more popular nowadays with knight c6 instead of a6. But a6 is very effective. A6 is a move that's played in literally every Sicilian, and it keeps maximum flexibility. Right? You can put the knight on c6 if you want as black, or you could put it on d7. You could go for an early b5. You could decide where you want to put your g8 knight, your your CA bishop, your F8 bishop. I mean, you can just decide. You have free range with all of your pieces. You haven't committed any pieces yet, right? While making a move that you're going to play anyway. So, at the same time, A6 doesn't put any pressure on White's position. So White also has more flexibility, which is kind of funny. Black has more flexibility, but White also has more flexibility. And here we see Fischer take advantage of that by playing bishop d3. You can't play bishop d3 if Black plays knight c6, right? Because the knight on d4 would be hanging. So bishop d3. The idea is to not rush playing knight c3. Still have options of putting the pawn on c4, and also the bishop can be very effective on d3 because it can really line up on some h7 ideas if black castles kingside. A lot of times white goes f4 e5 and tries to open up the pieces, maybe queen h5, maybe rook f3, rook h3. Common ideas that white tries to go for in the Sicilian. Bishop d3, knight c6. Now it's kind of crazy that knight c6 now is no longer played because of this game. Pretty much, everyone goes, queen c7, knight f6, bishop c5 is like the traditional, is like kind of the old main line. These common moves, yeah, bishop c5 especially, and knight f6 are the big main moves. But knight c6 no one really plays anymore because of how Fischer played this game, just completely took over. And so knight takes c6, b takes c6. And so going knight takes c6 sounds, it looks kind of unusual, right? Like giving black the more central squares, right? Allowing black to capture towards the center, having more central control. But think about it, right? By going knight takes c6, b takes e6, it basically made this a6 move totally useless, right? Like what does this a6 move do now? Especially now that black can't go b5, right? So a6 is totally useless. So basically there's the justification that, hey, a6 is a wasted move. Also, by going knight takes c6, you didn't waste a tempo on defending the knight. So you basically playing more actively. Like, hey, black, you can have your center pawns, but I'm going to play actively. I'm going to get my pieces out. I'm going to play aggressively, right? And that's what Fischer does. Castles. Active, aggressive, developing moves here. d5, Petrosian's like, hey, I'm going to control the center. I'm going to take advantage while I have control the center. And Fischer really makes use of the fact that he's played bishop d3. He challenges the center right away with c4, and this is just a really effective move here. Just immediately challenging the center, especially since Black doesn't have any pieces developed. And so by challenging the center, maybe trying to open up the e file, trying to open up some possibilities against the king, right? I mean, this is just very effective, very aggressive play here, very effective. So knight f6, Petrosian, sorry, attempts to defend the pawn, but now Fischer just takes advantage of his development advantage. He's like, I'm just going to open up the position, right? When you have the development advantage, your opponent's king is not castled. If you can open up the position and go for a quick attack on your opponent's king, that is very effective. So we see that right here. Takes, 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 takes. Now, it's worth mentioning in this position, e takes d5 is definitely an inaccuracy here. A better move would be knight takes d5, not opening up the e file and also not not accepting an isolated pawn. But knight takes d5, bishop e4. It's still just a slight advantage for white. It's been proven in multiple games. You can go with something like queen f3 and go knight c3. Just you have a lot of ideas, on this pin, and so just a more comfortable position for white. So instead, e takes d5, knight c3, bishop e7, and now a really awesome move from Fischer, queen to a4 check. So queen to a4 check is a really cool move because it has two ideas, right? Number one, it's aggressive, right? Black is not castled yet, so how can we make it as difficult as possible for him to castle? How can we play actively, continue to bring more pieces out, do it with tempo, right? Queen a4 check brings a piece out with tempo, takes advantage of the fact that the king is not castled yet. So queen a4 check, very aggressive, very good. Also, the queen now has the idea of possibly going to the d4 square. So, for example, if Petrosian had played bishop d7, Fischer was going to go queen to d4. And now look how nicely placed this queen is on the d4 square, right? Now the knight is threatening to capture on d5, which is very effective. Another threat, right? Which makes it that much harder for black to castle easily. And so here, instead, Petrosian goes for an interesting idea, a more combative idea, a queen to d7. And so this is really where we get to see Fischer, and this is what I was mentioning before, really get the position that he wanted to. And so, off the bat, bishop e5, it's funny enough, this is actually the best move in the position. A really cool tactical idea, right? Taking advantage of the pin. But this is kind of what Petrosian was going for, right? He was hoping that after a takes, queen takes, castles, the idea is now that, yeah, Petrosian is down in exchange, but this queen is kind of awkwardly placed. Petrosian go for ideas like bishop e7, d4, really try to put pressure on g2 maybe. And it's just a tricky position to hold. Now, I'm going to say this right now. This is actually the best way to play, but maybe not the best psychologically. Because think about it. Wouldn't you rather have an easy position where you have a clear advantage and you're just outplaying your opponent than a objectively better position, but you have to figure a lot of problems out, right? And the win just feels a little trickier, right? So the computer says that bishop b5, winning the material, winning the exchange right away is the better play. But instead, Fischer goes for rook e1. And this is really just, once again, where he gets the position that he wants. And it's clearly better. It's maybe not immediately winning, but it is just clearly better and just very comfortable. So rook e1, once again, developing move, effective, comes with a threat, right? Or actually, I should say, it prevents black from doing what he wants to do, right? And so the idea here is by developing the rook to e1, now this puts pressure on the e file. So now it's hard for black to castle because if castles, now queen takes, and rook takes e7, he just won the bishop, right? So once again, still making it hard for black to do what he wants to do. So in the game, we have Petrosian goes queen takes a4, knight takes a4, bishop e6. Now the idea is to castle once again now that the pin has been broken on the e7 bishop. Bishop e3. Once again, developing pieces, coming with a plan. How can we, get something to the c5 score, which is a big weakness? Castles, bishop c5. This knight would be so awesome if it's on the c5 square, right? And so this is really where we start to see Fischer just start setting up a really dominating piece here. So rook e8 takes, and here Fischer plays a really awesome move. I know sometimes I thought about this too when I was really moving up the ranks. Before I became international master, maybe when I was like a national master, I was moving up. I was really thinking after watching these Grandmaster games, I'm like, Grandmasters never rush to occupy squares, right? They always improve their position to the maximum so that when they do occupy the square, it's as effective as possible and really hurts the opponent as much as possible, right? So here, knight c5 technically is a decent move, but it's, and it occupies a really strong square. But after a5, right, this pawn has gained space and it makes it, now it's not really a target, can't really be attacked, right? And it prevents Fischer from gaining space here. So instead, Fischer goes b4 first. Very, very strong idea. The idea is that now, if a5 ever happens, b5 is going to be an amazing pass pawn and very strong. So only now is Fischer going to occupy this very strong c5 square, right, with his knight. Now that this pawn has been fixed on a6 because it can't move, because otherwise the pawn comes to b5, right? So really just a nice little move thrown in there. So b4, we have king f8, knight c5, bishop c8, defending the a6 pawn, and now f3. Once again, just very effective play, eliminating any possible play, controlling more space, controlling more squares. Now this knight cannot come to e4. Oopsies. Cannot come to e4 there. And so just making this knight a worse piece. Possibly ideas of bringing the king into f2. Maybe the king can even come to d4 at some point, which would be very effective. Even ideas of possibly gaining space on the king side, right? Space is the most important element in chess. Gaining space is very effective. Maybe combining attack on the ace pawn with gaining space and creating weakness on the king side, principle of two weaknesses. A lot of plans that white has here. So f3, rook a7. Basically, the idea that Petrosian has at this point, it's kind of a weird looking move, right? Like lining up the rooks like this on the a file. Basically, Petrosian's idea is to go bishop d7. And he can do that now because now the a6 pawn is securely defended. If Fischer decided to take on a6 after bishop d7, it would be trading away his two really good minor pieces for a rook and a pawn, which most of the time the minor pieces are going to be better than the rook and the pawn. And the idea of bishop d7 is finally to get the piece active, right? The bishop come to d7, come to b5, trying to just get some activity, try to get the pieces kind of unwound here, right? So here, rook e5. King f2 comes later. Rook e5, just improving the rook. Bishop d7. And so now at this point, we have what is probably probably a top 10 most commonly discussed move in the history of chess. And so in this position, Fischer actually goes knight takes d7. So this is a really interesting point because this knight on c5, as is the topic of today's lesson, is clearly a very good piece, right? The knight on c5 is a great piece. Fischer did everything he could to make this piece as good as possible, right? It's firmly outposted on the c5 square, very aggressive, makes this pawn stuck, makes these rooks stuck defending the pawn, right? This knight is an awesome piece. And this bishop is kind of bad, right? Petrosian has a lot of pawns on the light squares, right? Like a6 and d5. This bishop doesn't really do much. It's not attacking anything. It's just a passive piece. So Fischer decides to take this bishop, right? Which is extremely non-intuitive, right? But this is just a really, really, really awesome move. And this kind of goes back to the idea, right, of net gains, right? So sometimes it's better to give up your one really good piece if that makes all of your other pieces that much better, right? So think about it. Going into this bishop on d7, while it is a bad piece, it does challenge this bishop on d3, right? It is a light square bishop, which inherently will challenge white's light square bishop. This bishop, once it comes to b5, right, trying to prevent the opponent's plan, has the idea of protecting this pawn on a6. So by getting rid of this bishop on d7, right, that means that this pawn on a6 cannot be protected, and it's going to be a firm, an easy target for this bishop on d3, right? Also, this bishop on d7 controls a lot of the entry squares for white's rooks, right? Controls the, some squares on the e file, especially e8, and also controls squares like c8 and c6. So by getting rid of this d7 bishop, these two rooks are going to be better. So not only these two rooks are going to be better, but now this bishop is going to be better because now this the bishop on d7 that was going to go to b5 cannot control the a6 pawn and protect it, right? So now this bishop just has a clear attack. So openings for the rooks now by getting rid of the bishop, as well as a clear target for this bishop and just unopposed bishop, right? Knight takes d7. Rook takes. Knight takes is impossible because of rook takes d5 and just winning a clean pawn. So rook takes d7, rook c1. Now we see full taking advantage of Fischer. Fischer just taking full advantage of the position here and really just bringing his rook into just the c6 square if he can, or just really just controlling the c file, which is easy now because the bishop has gone on d7, right? So the rest of the game is just really easy. Actually, it's crazy how quickly Petrosian's position falls apart here, and it's just crazy. This just shows the power of sometimes giving up your best piece to make all of your other pieces better can be totally a worthwhile exchange. So rook c7, rook comes into the seventh rank, knight d7, rook e2, and so now we just see Fischer just really just prod open Petrosian's position and just brings in the king. To f2. The king can even come to d4, which is really effective. We have h5, and it's crazy because it's like Petrosian's almost in Zugzwang at this point. I mean, this rook is stuck defending this pawn. This pawn can't move to a5 because b5 happens, right? This knight can't really move because then Fischer brings his rook to e7 and just takes over the seventh rank. This rook can't move because his knight's stuck. This pawn on d5 can't move because if d5, then the bishop could be activated on c4, so that's not great. Uh, the king can't even move on f8 because then once again the rook comes to e7 and it's very aggressive on the seventh rank. So we just see Trojan trying to fill in any moves here he can. So h5, but this actually weakens the g6 pawn, which we see right away. Ideas of going f5, attacking the g6 pawn. Also possible ideas of maybe king g3 to h4 and maybe even king to g5, which is crazy. h4, king to f3. Now the idea is to go king to g4 and just pick off this h4 pawn, which Petrosian prevents with f5, but that's a big weakening of the seventh rank, right? Playing the pawn to f5. Now king to e3. And so this is one final kind of prodding move here. The idea is to put the king on d4 and just really have a completely dominating position with the king. King in the endgame is worth 4 points. Probably in this position, it's worth more. Just very effective, very powerful piece. So also provoking the move d4, filling that square. And so now the king can't go to d4. But after king to d2, now this diagonal's been opened, right? And this, I mean, now the king on f8 just has no squares to go to. Knight b6, trying to prevent bishop c4, but once again, playing with purpose, right? Seeing what your opponent did, trying to play against that, right? And, trying to see any squares that your opponent weakened. Here, now the rook comes into e7, and this is just game over. Knight d5, rook f7 check, king to e8, rook to b7. Knight takes f4, wins a pawn, doesn't really do anything when there's checkmate on the horizon, bishop to c4. And in this position, Petrosian actually resigned. And so it's not hard to see why. I mean, the idea is very simple, just going rook h7, rook h8, and there's really no way to prevent it. It's just completely resignable at this point. Just a simple mate threat. And it's crazy because this knight is just out of the way. It can't really prevent it. This rook, I mean, what's it going to do to guard the h8 square? This rook clearly can't prevent it either. So just a very, very awesome game from Fischer, and really just kicked off with this knight takes d7 check, right? It really just set off just the downfall of Petrosian's position. Fischer was, not opposed to giving up. He's very open-minded. He's not afraid to give up his best piece if that made all of his other pieces better, right? So, the d7 bishop, although it's not really that great of a piece, it still had a role, right? And that role actually really impacted how all of White's pieces played. So by getting rid of that bishop, that net gain of making all the other white pieces better, the two rooks having more squares in the open files, the bishop having an unopposed target on a6, right, the pawn on a6, that just made all the other pieces better, and that net gain was worth it, giving up that really good knight for this supposedly bad bishop on d7, right? And so here, these two games that I showed y'all, the Capablanca as black and the Fischer as white game, really both have giving up a good knight for a bad bishop. But you can have multiple scenarios, right? You can have, like we saw here, good knight taking a bad bishop to increase square control to make all the other pieces better. You can see a good bishop traded for a bad knight. You can see all sorts of examples, right, of of exchanges happening, of getting rid of your good piece to make all of your other pieces better. You can see exchange sacrifices that do the same thing. Just really an interesting concept, this idea of net gains, right? And so I was really thinking, this idea took me a long time to be able to explain this idea of net gains, but it's such an important idea when you really think about it. It's honestly it's just math, right? You might lose that value you have from that one piece, right? But you gain all this other value by making all of your other pieces better. So just a really awesome concept. I hope these two games, the Capablanca and Fischer games, really helped y'all understand better kind of what makes a piece good, and when it's good to trade your good piece for a bad piece, right? And not being afraid to think outside the box, and not be afraid to give up your good piece if sometimes that can be the best decision to make all of your other pieces better. So yeah, really awesome. Really hope y'all enjoyed these games. Really hope y'all enjoyed this lesson, and we'll be coming by with another lesson soon. Hope y'all have an awesome day, and thank you for watching.